Well, first of all, let me introduce just a little bit my researches. I'm a social geographer and also an urban planner. I used to be an urban planner, being a social geographer and being an academics. I focus my work, the local space, the local society, adapt to global, national, and social incentives and injunctions. I won't use a specific case study. I prefer to give you a more general view of what is changing in France on this both aspect of educational and urban planning issues. Well, you probably know, like many Western countries, education and regional urban planning in France have been subject to changes rooted in the state decentralization process. In Europe, most of the educational and decentralization reform enacted since the 1980s tend to reorganize relationships, regulation between the national and the local, and between education and planning according to a post-bureaucratic paradigm. And many scholars have underlined the changes affecting the educational state and the emergence of neoliberal or post-bureaucratic rhetoric, norms, and ideologies. Well, in France, this last decades, educational policies have been subject to unfinished phases of decentralization. Starting in the 1980s, what has been called the three acts of decentralization, it sounds like a French tragedy, sorry. The three acts of decentralization experience difficulties to transform the educational state, which is inherited from the building of the French Republic in the late 19th centuries, and which is characterized by a uniform and centralized pace of schooling into local and autonomous educational territories. This long process follows two phases. The first one, known as Act 1 and 2 of the French decentralization, is synchronous with a post-bureaucratic rhetoric valuing what we call in France territorial logic, local authorities, local actors, and local stakeholders' involvement in both education and urban planning issues, and it also means the contractualization of public action from the central state to local authorities. The purpose is to help the emergence of local educational spaces, ensuring national equity in education and favoring a local mode of educational governance. The local at this time seems to be both the horizon and the ideal space for educational decentralization policies, even if it obviously lacks a strong conceptual definition. The second phase, known as Act 3 of decentralization, strongly modifies the geography of schooling following a more neoliberal path. The French state introduced logics of accountability and assessment, and many things that have been seen in North America and in Europe, school assessment and so on. Well, my purpose is in a context in which the state is transforming itself from an educational state to what we call an evaluator state, how the local is transforming, and the local has thus to be reconsidered. I will use the concept of spaces of interdependencies to understand how the local adapt to these multiple changes and injunctions and produce what I call territorial arrangement or territorial tinkering for national social issues. My hypothesis is that local space of schooling has to become interdependency characterized by social-spatial systems of regulation, instances of multi-scalar coordination, and by an hybridization of norms favoring in a post-decentralized period educational entrepreneurships. Let's do just a little bit of history, a short time history, of course. Let's go back to the 1980s. Like many European countries in the early 1980s, France committed state reform following a complex and unfinished decentralization process, which has been characterized by scholars as a minimal decentralization. The objective of what is known as the first act of decentralization is to articulate in a single movement the reform of both the territorial state, the centralized state controlling land and regional planning, and the educational state, the central state as the main organizer, planner, and leader for educational policies into territorial governance. Well, as you can see on this slide, a complex, very complex educational framework has been set, dividing educational responsibilities according to the new institutional architecture of the country. If I want to be simple, I try to be simple on this slide. The region manages and finances high schools, what we call the département, which is a local authority, a kind of big district, manage middle school, municipalities, primary schools, but the state is omnipresent. The state still manages university, research, a part of vocational training and planning, and is also responsible for financing and directing teaching management, salaries, academic program, national academic program, etc., etc. So it's a kind of false decentralization for education. I will talk about later. Well, decentralization in schooling can be defined for the French case as a transfer of a small number of responsibility, planning and financing school facilities regarding the management and non from the central to the local authorities. Well, the first act of decentralization is formalized in 4 major public policies strongly articulated. The first of all is called Politique de la Ville, which is a set of urban, social and housing programs targeting deprived neighborhood in social housing complex in la banlieue, the post-urban areas. Second program is the priority education area politics, following the British experience from the 1970s. Third is the devolution of power and responsibility in many fields of education, planning, and economic development. And fourth, a program focusing local democracy incentives. Well, educational decentralization is first placed under the auspice of urban issues in la banlieue deprived neighborhood, considers as experimental spaces. According to la politique de la ville, the purpose is to help the emergence of local educational spaces, ensuring national equity in education and favoring a local mode of educational governance in which stakeholders and local actors, such as ethnic communities, parents, can be involved in the educational process and urban planning process. This first act of decentralization still refers to the universalist republican notions of national equality inherited from the building of the French Republic. It leads to design educational decentralization following injunction of social justice and equity. Considering this, decentralization process in education has been thought in the 1980s, not in terms of spatial homogenization and unification, but merely in terms of social and spatial differentiation, according to a new slogan, give more to those who have less. Following priority education areas and social housing policies, a strong articulation is set in place between education and urbanism, first in the deprived neighborhood and second in the whole country. Well, rhetoric, norms and tools are then transferred from the urbanism field to education and school planning. They do rely on a specialized regulation of education following 2 watchwords. The first one is territoire, territory, and the second is contractualization. Well, territory is very different from the British exception. It's a very different sense. It relies, in the French tradition, it relies on the believing that the local, the territoire is most of the time a local spaces, is a socially, culturally, and politically built by stakeholders and constitute a socio-spatial territory that is both a priority target for public actions and a central scene to their implementation by local actors. It refers to the notion of social space, a space socially, culturally, historically appropriate and object of social representation and local identity, and also to a political space, a space institutionally delimited. Ethological and political dimension are constitutive parts of this notion. This notion, let's have a short history of this notion. This notion knows a growing success both in the academic field, mainly in geography and in sociology, in the French geography and French sociology, and also in the public action domain. And there's a strong permeability, a strong porosity between the French academic tradition of territorial, mainly in social and cultural geography, and the public action domain. And then territoire, the word territoire itself, became a dominant paradigm for public action. First experimented in schooling and education planning in priority education areas, and after in the whole country. Then this notion of territory justifies politics of affirmative action. Actually, it's not really affirmative action, but it's something very close to affirmative action. And politics of affirmative action, according to the acknowledgement of some very specific requirements and needs of some urban territories, like in la banlieue. And it is also an instrument used by the state to modernize public action. The so-called modernity of territory used by local and national authorities bring new notions, projects, partnerships, capacity building, used in order to ease the involvement of the local. By local, I include local actors, local institutions, also association, parent involvement, local community leaders, etc. And also a way to rationalize public action. A large set of tools and instruments have been locally implemented to help local authority to fit with this national requirement, both in the educational and the urban planning domains. You can see such names like contrat éducatif local, local educative contract, territorial educational project, and so on. And contractualization is the main media used by the state to decentralize education to local authority, to finance school planning, to finance educational action in favor of social education or social development, according to many national incentives and injunctions. Followed 2 decades of contractual cooperation in local school planning, known as a co-building policy between the state and local actors. Well, this co-building process is strongly marked by urbanistic ideologies, promoting rhetoric of projects and new values at this time, such as social mixing and proximity. Emerging at the end of the 1970s as a reaction against modern urbanism and functionalism, the notion of project, here to be understood as urban project and territorial project, and later on as educational local project, appears among urban planners and politicians as the most theoretical and practical way to deal with urban and social issues in la banlieue. The success of this notion of urban project, can be first explained because it fits with the growing demand for local democracy and for the involvement of local actors. And second, the success of this notion also fits with state injunction to modernize local action around new tools. One of these tools, one of the most popular tools used in education, is the Territorial Educational Project. You have here a small picture of the latest territorial education project used and implemented by the municipality of Perpignan, where I live and work. The Territorial Educational Project is a clear extension of the urban planning norms. It means the implementation of at local scale of a strategic schooling plan. Stakeholders, local actors, including parent association, churches, etc., in connection to the urban planning issues, social mixing, etc. It relies on a project engineering procedure, locally declined and embedded in a city master plan called le contrat de ville, which is a procedure involving education in the urban and neighborhood planning process. This contractual logics and practice involve a growing network of organizations and actors, drawing new institutions and new territorial limits, priority education areas, special education zone, intercommunal cooperation emerging, school clusters, social development program, etc., etc. Well, basically, this territorial paradigm and the ideology of proximity were used as a temporary experience limited to deprived neighborhood. And this model of educational governance was largely spread and trivialized as a common procedure for local authority, first in urban and then in suburban and rural areas, and popularized as the territorial paradigm in the French scientific literature and later on by the state governments. The territorial paradigm became a dominant figure in the thinking, planning, and governance of education at the local scale, largely spread at all levels of institutional authorities, from municipal to region. It relies on an ideology valuing the notion of proximity, using rhetoric of territorial projects and largely fueled by the urbanism and regional planning practices. Territorial projects cover a series of local initiatives such as school districts planning and new allocation of resources for non-teaching staff, for example. It can be a large set of tools initiated on a contractual basis, like territorial educative plan or special education plan, etc. Design also the involvement of local community at different scale. But by the 1990s, the injection of social mixing and equality are becoming secondary objectives. By the 1990s and the growing autonomy of local municipality and the marketization of urban planning and the internationalization of local authority in France, the purpose is to use of territorial governance to build local educational territories based on local development issues. Practices of territorial education and practices of urban planning, a growing autonomy in education planning, answering new needs, school choice, incentive for parental school choice, new construction for educational facilities, an adaptation to school demographic forecast, strategy planning regarding housing strategy or economic strategy, and that explain a large profusion of local initiative at different scale, all behind the same paradigm, territorial paradigm, and the notion of proximity. Well, I tried to synthesize the changes of and the evolution of both the territorial paradigm and the what I call the ideology of proximity used in the educational territorial governance in France, based on my experience of research in the region Midi-Pyrénées-Languedoc-Roussillon and also in some other region. And we can observe that the uses of this notion of proximity and territorial paradigm in school planning by local authorities involve clearly 3 steps. Basically, the use of territorial paradigm follow national injunction of social mixing, local partnership, etc., in the name of priority education. Proximity is seen as both a social and a spatial proximity in order to answer social mixing and social housing injunctions. It's quite clear. By the 1980s and the 1990s, things are changing. The territorial spread of this territorial paradigm outside the perimeter of priority education area opened a second step in which local authority developed their own agenda, answering local needs, building of school facility, of sport facilities, answering parental needs for school choice, new perimeters, according to local housing priority and objectives. Local authority manage now their own extracurriculum program, focusing cultural initiative like regional language or culture. And proximity is here to be understood as a larger geographical proximity, both a physical distance, which is not embedded in the micro-local space, and also proximity is to be understood as an institutional proximity, cooperation between stakeholders. Third, by the year 2010, proximity and the paradigm change once again. Proximity takes the shape in political discourse and in the practice of urban planner and educational planner takes the shape of something that looks like a polymorphous spaces that overflow and encompass space of the school district, or the city of the region. The territorial paradigm is therefore used to describe a local complexity in the management of education with new forms of cooperation and interdependencies between stakeholders and local actors at different scale. As you can see in this on this slide, it's more interscalar regulation that is being set with spatial interdependency, new form of cooperation between actors. Well, despite the omnipresence and power of the central state, the first phase of decentralization favors a new local educational order, which is characterized by a growing autonomy for local authorities, by the spread of a state territorial thinking, diffusing at a local scale a new semantic universe, project, governance, management, partnership, and so on. If basically educational planning was guided by social injunction, it's quickly turns into local development issues, building and planning facilities, how to finance extracurriculum program, fight rural desertification, forecast population growth or decline, etc. The proliferation of initiatives in the 1980s from the 1980s to the year 2000 leads to a growing complexification of the geography of schooling in France at different scale, leading to a territorial fragmentation, to a lack of legitimacy for local authorities that have gone far behind their initial mandate and legal competences. A territorial complexity emerged and asked for another spatial regulation and mode of governance. Critics, mainly conservative critics, denounce the fragmentation of the local and the territorial complexity, making impossible to answer educational challenges such as school choice or international competition, such as a pizza shock. We also have a pizza shock in France, but with another debate. And the debate in France at this time aroused the idea of new institutional and new territorial arrangement and the need for a territorial governance taking account the management of spatial interdependencies thus created by decentralization process and the need for more flexibility. Well, then come the Act 3 of a French tragedy, the second phase of decentralization. And at Act 3, it's a funny tragedy. It's very similar to the Italian tragedy. It's not so sad, don't worry for us. Well, the context changed according to the 2012 and 2015 new territorial reform, known as Act 3 of decentralization, that reshapes the institutional maps of the country from 24 administrative political regions to 30 new regions, known as a territorial reform, and at the same time create new educational region, new academic region, which follow the same boundaries. There is a strong homothesis between the academic region and the new political region, which is quite new in the French context. The issue relies on the quest for the good scale and for what has been qualified by the French central authorities as the territorial optimum. This reform tend to search to optimize territorial specialization. Well, behind this new territorial rhetoric, one can see a partial regionalization of education and the return of the state. Well, it's kind of a schizophrenic return, as I will explain. This return is both a withdrawal and a return of the state in the local sphere. The state reform actually signaled the repositioning of the central state, which role now is less to locally implement contractual national policies, but merely to develop on a new scale, or so-called new scale, the region, la région, a space of coordination and regulation between local and national. Well, let me explain all of this. Well, this conception of the state action in education and also in urban planning rely on new watchwords: accountability, assessment, and the implementation of new tools to regulate state resources, like strategic steering, partnerships with the private sector this time, and school assessment and so on. Like in Germany, probably, school and school principals are invested with new responsibility and autonomy in the staff management, in the management of the flow of pupils from one school to another, in the relationships with local authorities, etc. Well, a more dynamic system of exchanges, relationships, and interdependencies between schools themselves, between local actors, and between school and local authorities, and between local authorities has been initiated very fastly. The former system of schooling, embedded in proximity at the micro level, just broke up, while a new system of regulation is being set. I tried to draw a new system, but I'm afraid it's not so clear. Well, a new system is being set. In this one, relationships among school and school principal, among different actors, are characterized by new forms of cooperation and competition. They redefine the space of schooling as something more polymorphous. I use the expression of polymorphous spaces to describe a space less dependent on institutional perimeter and more dependent on the numerous interdependency locally generated between actors, stakeholders, and local authorities. We can understand these polymorphous spaces as educational spaces of interdependencies. These educational spaces of interdependencies rely on a local specialized system of regulation, competition, concurrence. They also rely on the presence of instances of coordination and dialogue, and they have to be considered as a social-spatial system of regulation with a multiscalar coordination and governance, and by hybridization of norms, favoring, in a post-decentralized period, a local educational entrepreneurship. Let me explain. First, this mode of territorial governance redefine and redesign the local, not as a single socio-spatial unit, but merely as a set of local educational spaces of interdependency placed under a partial regional authority and characterized by a rescaling process, articulating different scale and different injunction. Regional, I will tell you that the region now is a very important actor in education. National, of course, municipal, local, sometimes intermunicipal. A growing autonomy for school and school principal. The diversification of the source of school financing. The introduction of new principles, such as very neat principles like equity, resource optimization, assessment, etc. And the capacity to set strategic planning, associating deeply educational demographic forecast planning issues. Well, as I told you, it's not very simple to explain, and I hope this figure is not too complicated. Well, the context has changed very fastly in France and many Western countries. This is the end of the educational state, and this is the emerging of what we can qualify as an evaluator state. In this mode of governance, of territorial governance, the relationships between the national and the local are no more regulated like they were in the 1980s, by a logic of contractualization embedded in specific territories using tools such as Territorial Education Project. It relies now on a system of devolution in which the state operates at a distance through a new administrative and territorial level, the région académique, the academic region, here in red on the map. It's something really new. Since the year 2015, this new level is led by what we call a rector, which is not a rector like in a university, which is just like a préfet in France. I mean, is a representative of the French government, the national French government, at the local scale at the regional scale for educational issues. He has the power of the state at the local level, and he acts as a I would say, as a buffer actor, a kind of buffer zone, buffer level between the local and the national. That's why many political scientists use an expression. They say the state now in France is governing at a distance through this kind of buffer actor. Well, we can see that in America also, and probably in most of the Western European countries. Well, since 2015, the region academic and the rector introduced another level, federating under the rector all the local educational territories and actors. The rector, most of the time presented as a super rector, centralizes public subsidies and coordinates stakeholders. Its role not only consists in regulating public action and public subsidies, it also puts local authorities in competition for financing educational program, extracurriculum program, according to calls for project procedures. Well, this change, of course, answer incentives for a more neoliberal turn in the French educational system, valuing new ideologies, educational efficiency versus school equity, strategic steering in place of contractization, and of course, educational entrepreneurship and entrepreneur. The region is now clearly an educational entrepreneur, and the new region have to, for example, implement project training plan expressing regional economic and educational objective in the same document. They define a long-term investment plan, a 10 years plan for school financing, and they set objectives at the infra level. So this reform reinforces form of educational entrepreneurship, at two different scales, the regional one and also the local one. It opened the way, like in most European countries, to the private sectors. And educational entrepreneurship can be also understood as new capabilities for local actors, both local institutions, local authorities, and the social society in a whole, to develop, promote, and implement educational action in a very weak, institutionalized, and multi-scalar system. Well, don't forget we're in France, and we are not really a neoliberal country. We're not really a liberal country at all. And this kind of changes raise many questions and many reactions. It appears to be an hidden deregulation and neo-liberalization agenda for education, and many tension and resistance arise. First, the strengths of the Republican educational model, which is firmly established in the local, in local institution, and also in social representation at the local level. Also, we can notice the stakeholder reluctance, teacher unions, parents association, that seriously delay the development, implementation of these new educational norms. And second, the change is also source of political conflict on the national and the local scenes, depending on political changeover between left and right parties. Well, finally, at many regions in France, we observe, and specifically in my region, Midi-Pyrénées, Languedoc-Roussillon, we observe an ongoing hybridization of norms and practices. First, a state-centralized and republican norms. As I told you in my introduction, state alternate withdrawal and return. Second, a partial local and regional autonomy. And third, the introduction of quasi-market logics, mainly in parental school choice. Well, to conclude, To conclude, for many scholars, French current situation is one of a territorial complexity. Well, probably I will surprise you, but I'm not so sure. It is obvious that today educational order is organized under spaces of educational interdependencies that have succeeded to form a educational order inherited from the French tradition, or for the first phase of decentralization. The new reforms institute a complex regionalization of education. They also introduce a little bit of neoliberalization. And it leads to an hybridization of norms, of practices mixed at different scale. This hybridization seems to be poorly institutionalized and spatially produce what can be described not as a territorial complexity, but much more as territorial arrangement or as territorial tinkering in which local actors, local stakeholders face state injunction, global injunction, social need, and also implement their own strategies. So behind this apparent complexity, one can find a socio-spatial organization structured by local educational space of interdependencies with uncertain and changing perimeters, with a multi-scalar governance and a profusion of initiatives according to the relationships experienced by actors. So, more than just an unfinished decentralization process, which is attached to the French case study in the scientific literature, we must analyze this French situation as a new educational order based on space of interdependencies, introducing new forms, probably, of social and spatial inequality based upon local capabilities to adapt to these changes and to these new forms of interdependencies.